The wind, a relentless whisper of dust and forgotten hopes, scoured the small, isolated cabin on the edge of the sprawling plains. It was a place where silence reigned, a heavy, omnipresent blanket woven from the vastness of the territory and the solitude of its inhabitant. Ilara, her hands calloused by years of relentless toil, moved with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to enduring, her gaze often distant, fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something that had long vanished, or perhaps for something yet to arrive. Her life here was a stark canvas of survival, painted in shades of sun-baked earth, and an unspoken grief that clung to her like the prairie dust. She was a woman hardened by circumstance, yet beneath the weathered exterior lay a reservoir of emotions, complex and often contradictory, a mosaic of loss and an enduring, if fragile, sense of humanity. It was this quiet existence, this fragile peace, that was shattered not by the distant thunder of a storm, but by a sound far more primal, more terrifying. A strangled cry, abruptly cut short, followed by the soft, disturbing rustle of disturbed dry grass, just beyond her modest fence line. Her heart, usually a steady drumbeat of resilience, lurched. The world she knew, confined to the perimeter of her meager farm, felt suddenly permeable, vulnerable. Every instinct screamed for caution, for retreat, for the self-preservation that had become her guiding principle. Yet something in that truncated sound, a vulnerability too raw to ignore, pulled her forward. She moved, not with courage, but with a reluctant curiosity, a morbid pull towards the disruption. What she found, huddled amongst the tall, whispering prairie grasses, was not the expected predator or the desperate wanderer she might have encountered before. It was a boy, no older than 10, his skin the color of rich earth, his small frame contorted, a dark stain blossoming on his worn buckskin tunic. He was Comanche, unmistakable in his attire and the fierce, defiant light, dimmed by pain, in his eyes. A child of the very land she sought to tame, a child of the people her kind spoke of in hushed, fearful tones, labeling them savages, an untamed force to be eradicated. And he was wounded, gravely so, a broken arrow shaft protruding grotesquely from his side, a testament to a violence unseen, a conflict that had spilled over onto her doorstep. This was not merely an intruder. This was a fractured echo of a larger, escalating war laid bare at her feet. The air thickened, charged with the unspoken history between their peoples, with the immediate visceral threat he represented, and with the undeniable humanity of his suffering. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The boy's eyes, dark pools reflecting a mixture of pain and suspicion, tracked her every move. Ilara stood over him, a silhouette against the vast, indifferent sky, a strange tableau of conflicting worlds on the desolate plains. Her initial reaction was a chaotic surge of fear, a primal instinct to protect herself, her small sanctuary, from the inherent dangers this discovery presented. The stories whispered in the fledgling settlements, tales of raids and retribution, of children stolen and lives brutally ended, flashed through her mind like wildfire. He was a Comanche, a potential harbinger of violence, a silent accusation of all the land had endured. Yet observing him closer, the shallow, ragged breaths, the clench of his small fists in the dirt, the raw, unadulterated agony twisting his young face, something deeper stirred within her. It was a familiar ache, a ghost of a memory that she had long tried to bury beneath layers of stoicism and hard labor. It was the memory of helplessness, of a child's vulnerability, a silent plea that transcended the boundaries of race or tribe. She knelt, cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate, designed to convey a lack of threat. His eyes, wary and watchful, remained fixed on her, assessing, judging even in his weakened state. There was no defiance in him now, only the fading embers of youthful resilience. She extended a hand, calloused fingers pausing inches from his bleeding wound. "Child," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse, a sound that felt alien in the vast silence. "You are hurt." Her words were simple, shorn of any complexity, yet they carried a weight, an unburdened truth. He flinched, a slight tremor running through his small body. But he did not pull away entirely. The arrow, crude and tipped with obsidian, was lodged deep, an iron refusal of his young body to yield to its cruel intrusion. It spoke of a desperate flight, of a pursuit that must have been relentless. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that wherever this boy came from, whoever had put that arrow in him, and whoever he belonged to, they would be searching. The vastness of the plains could conceal much, but not indefinitely. The decision was not born of altruism, not entirely. It was a complex, tangled knot of impulses, a forgotten flicker of empathy, a pragmatic assessment of the danger of leaving him to die on her doorstep, and perhaps a perverse challenge to the very world that had shaped her into this solitary, hardened woman. She reached for him, her touch hesitant but firm as she began to assess the wound, her mind already calculating the bleak odds of survival. There was no warmth in her touch, no overt tenderness, only a grim determination. She pulled at the arrow with a grunt, a sharp, searing pain erupting from the boy as he let out a stifled cry. It was an act born of necessity, blunt and unyielding. The arrow snapped, leaving the head embedded, a sinister promise of infection and further suffering. This boy, this unexpected intrusion, was not a choice but a consequence, a living, breathing testament to the brutal realities of their shared existence. And as she wrestled with the broken shaft, the silence of the prairie seemed to press down on them, heavy with unspoken questions and the shadow of an uncertain future. Inside the dim, cool cabin, the air hung heavy with the scent of dried herbs and the faint, coppery tang of fresh blood. Ilara worked with a grim efficiency, her movements practiced yet devoid of any gentle touch. She was not a healer by trade, but necessity had long been her sternest teacher. Her knowledge was born of countless minor injuries, of ailments that could mean the difference between life and death on the isolated frontier. The boy, small and pale beneath the grime and the terrifying bloom of the wound, lay on her makeshift cot, his breaths shallow, each one a testament to his fading strength. She had cleaned the wound as best she could, using water heated over the embers and strips of an old clean linen sheet. The arrowhead remained, a dark, malevolent presence under his skin, a constant reminder of the violence that had brought him here. She knew the risks, the fever that would inevitably come, the infection that would fester and claim him. Yet she persevered, driven by a silent, unyielding refusal to let another life slip away under her roof, not without a fight. He watched her, his eyes unblinking, his young face a mask of pain and profound mistrust. There were no words exchanged, not truly. He spoke in a language alien to her, a string of guttural sounds and sharp cries when her ministrations caused him particular agony. She responded only with a low murmur, a hushing sound that was less comfort and more command. The air between them was thick with unspoken histories, with the collective memory of bloodshed and displacement that marked their respective peoples. He was a symbol of the wild, untamed land, a representative of the very force that settlers like her sought to conquer. And she, in his eyes, was likely an echo of the invaders, the ones who pushed relentlessly westward. Yet, a peculiar bond began to form in the crucible of his suffering. It was not one of affection, but of necessity, a fragile pact forged in the shared space of vulnerability. He needed her to survive, and in a way she couldn't yet articulate, she needed him, if only to confront the deeper truths that his presence unearthed within her own stoic facade. Days bled into a timeless blur. The boy's fever raged, then receded, then surged anew. His small body, racked by tremors and punctuated by pained whimpers, fought a battle for which she could only provide a meager arsenal of aid. She fed him spoonfuls of thin broth, coaxed drops of water past his parched lips and changed the bloodied bandages, with a methodical determination that bordered on obsession. During the lucid moments his eyes, dark and intelligent, would meet hers, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Was it gratitude? Resignation? A silent question of why she bothered? She offered no explanation. What could she say? That in his suffering she saw a reflection of her own unaddressed wounds, a ghostly echo of a child lost, a life shattered? No, the silence was safer, more honest. It allowed the grim work of survival to continue, unimpeded by the messy entanglements of emotion. But as the third day dawned, A strange quiet settled over the cabin. The boy's fever had finally broken. He lay still, awake, his breathing even, a fragile victory. And outside, beyond the worn wooden walls, the sound of hoofbeats, numerous and purposeful, began to ripple across the vast, empty plains. The distant thrum at first was merely a vibration against the soles of her worn boots, a subtle disturbance in the rhythmic silence of the plains. Ilara, stirring a meager pot of stew over the crackling hearth, paused, her hand suspended, the wooden spoon still. The sound intensified, a low, resonant rumble that seemed to grow from the very earth beneath the cabin. It was not the isolated gallop of a lone rider, nor the familiar creak of a settler's wagon. This was something different, something powerful and undeniable, a deep, pervasive vibration that spoke of multitude, of purpose, of a force approaching with an almost geological inevitability. Her heart, a drum against her ribs, quickened its beat, a discordant counterpoint to the growing thunder outside. She walked to the small, grimy window, her movements slow, deliberate, as if haste might shatter the fragile peace she had so painstakingly built. The vista was immense, a tapestry of dry grasses swaying in the persistent wind, stretching to a horizon that bled into a sky of pale, indifferent blue. And then she saw them, not yet distinct shapes, but a cloud of dust, a towering ochre plume rising from the plains, obscuring the setting sun. It was a dust cloud born of many hoofbeats, a grim signature on the western sky. Her breath hitched. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the layers of her usual composure. She knew with an absolute certainty that chilled her to the bone who they were. Comanche. And there were many. Her gaze flickered to the cot where the boy lay. He was awake now, his dark eyes wide, fixed on her, a profound understanding dawning in their depths. He too had heard the sound, had felt the tremor in the earth, a resonance that was innate to his blood, a summons from his own people. A silent communication passed between them, a shared recognition of the storm that was about to break. This was the moment she had both dreaded and, in some unspoken corner of her being, anticipated. The fragile, isolated world she had constructed was about to collide with the raw, untamed forces of the plains, a confrontation she could not escape. A flashback, sudden and sharp as a broken shard of glass, pierced her thoughts. She saw another face, pale and small, framed by wisps of blonde hair, racked with a fever she could not break, a cough that echoed in the lonely silence of another long-lost cabin. A child of her own, taken by a sickness that defied her desperate prayers, her futile remedies. The memory was a searing brand, a constant reminder of helplessness, of life's brutal indifference. It was this ghost, this enduring sorrow, that had fueled her stoicism, that had driven her to this remote existence. And now, seeing the Comanche boy, fragile and recovering, a spark of life clinging to him, she realized the truth. She had fought for him not just for his sake, but for hers, to defy the specter of helplessness, to rewrite, however slightly, the ending of a story that had haunted her for years. The dust cloud drew closer, resolving into the unmistakable shapes of riders, strong and silent, their movements synchronized, a formidable display of power and purpose. 50 warriors, the initial count in her mind's rapid assessment, a dark wave cresting over the prairie. Her hands clenched, not in fear, but in a strange, resolute defiance. She had saved one life. Now she faced the true reckoning. The Comanche boy, his strength returning in a sudden surge, struggled to sit up. His gaze, no longer clouded by fever, was fixed on the window, his eyes reflecting the growing menace outside. He looked at Ilara, then back at the approaching riders, a complex emotion flitting across his young face, a mixture of relief, anticipation, and something else, a silent, curious observation of the woman who had sheltered him. The silence in the small cabin became a living entity, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thud of hooves on packed earth. Ilara stood her ground, her back straight, her expression a careful blankness that betrayed none of the tumultuous emotions raging within her. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, yes, but it was interwoven with a strange thread of inevitability, a sense that this moment, this confrontation, had been waiting for her since the first moment she found the boy. She had chosen, implicitly, to step outside the prescribed boundaries of her world, to defy the expectations and prejudices of her own people. Now the consequences had arrived, in the form of 50 armed warriors, led by a man whose presence, even from a distance, exuded an almost mythical authority. She could hear the snort of horses, the creak of leather, the subtle clink of metal. They were close now, so close that the very air seemed to vibrate with their presence. The boy made a small sound, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur in his own tongue, as if speaking to the approaching figures. Ilara did not understand the words, but she understood the sentiment. A welcome, a recognition, and in that moment, she realized the depth of the chasm she had unwittingly bridged. She, a white woman, alone on the plains, had taken in a Comanche child, an act that would be deemed madness, treachery even, by her own kind. And now, the boy's people, a force often depicted as faceless antagonists, were at her door, not just to retrieve one of their own, but to confront the one who had interfered, however benevolently. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had saved a life, yet now her own life hung by a thread, suspended in the balance of their unknown intentions. A memory surfaced, unbidden from years prior. The day her husband, a man whose kindness she had often taken for granted, had ridden off to trade in the nearest settlement and never returned. Not to hostile attack, but to a simple, mundane accident. A kicked horse, a broken neck. The sheer banality of that loss, the cruel twist of fate that ripped away her anchor, had left her adrift, untethered. It was a different kind of violence, quieter, more insidious, but just as devastating as any arrow. And now, facing 50 warriors, she realized that her present fear was tempered by the raw, unyielding understanding of loss that she carried. She had survived that. She could survive this. The approaching riders halted, their horses snorting, their forms silhouetted against the stark prairie light. They formed a silent, imposing semicircle, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed on the small cabin, on the woman framed in its doorway. At their head, a figure on a magnificent paint horse, taller than the rest, his face a landscape of harsh lines and fierce dignity, the boy's father. There was no need for introduction. The air crackled with a silent tension, a profound standoff between two worlds, two people, linked by the fragile life of a child. The lead warrior, a man whose presence filled the space with an almost tangible force, dismounted with an effortless grace that belied his formidable stature. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Ilara, then lingered on the cabin's doorway, as if seeing beyond the wood and stone to the life that had transpired within. There was no aggression in his stance, not yet, but an undeniable power, a quiet authority that spoke of a lifetime spent navigating the brutal realities of the plains. His gaze was an examination, a silent question aimed at the white woman who stood before him, unprotected and unyielding. The other warriors remained mounted, a silent, watchful perimeter, their faces inscrutable, their hands resting lightly on their weapons. The very air seemed to crackle with the weight of generations of conflict, of broken treaties and stolen lands, of blood spilled and promises unkept. This was not just a personal encounter. It was a microcosm of a larger, ongoing struggle, unfolding silently on the vast, indifferent prairie. Ilara met his gaze, her own eyes steady, unwavering. She offered no smile, no gesture of welcome or appeasement. To do so would be to feign a comfort she did not feel, and to diminish the grim reality of the situation. There was no place for polite pleasantries here, only the raw truth of their circumstances. She was a settler, he was a Comanche chieftain, and between them lay a wounded child, a fragile bridge across a chasm of mutual suspicion and historical animosity. She knew the stories they told of her people, of their insatiable hunger for land, their relentless push westward, their disregard for native ways. And she knew the stories her people told of them, of their ferocity, their raids, their perceived savagery. Both narratives, she understood, were incomplete, born of fear and self-preservation, cloaking the complex humanity of each side. But in this moment, those narratives dissolved, leaving only the stark reality of two individuals facing each other across an invisible line. The chieftain's gaze finally shifted to the cabin, a subtle flicker of concern, perhaps, in the depths of his eyes. He lifted a hand, a single, deliberate gesture. One of his warriors dismounted and entered the cabin, emerging moments later with the boy cradled in his arms. The child was awake, his eyes darting between Alara and his father, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips when their gazes finally met. The relief that washed over the chieftain was palpable, a silent outpouring of paternal love that transcended cultural divides. It was a raw, universally understood emotion, a thread connecting them despite the vast differences that separated their worlds. Alara watched, a strange ache in her chest. She had risked everything for this boy, defied her own ingrained fears, faced the specter of her past, and now he was gone, returned to his own. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken gratitude and unspoken warnings. What would be the price for her intervention? Would her act of unexpected kindness be met with a gesture of peace, or would it be seen as an intrusion, an unforgivable trespass? The chieftain's eyes, dark and unreadable, returned to her, holding her gaze in a long, searching silence that promised either salvation or utter devastation. The wind, once a mere whisper, now seemed a keen, a prelude to the unknown. The chieftain walked forward, his footsteps soft on the dry earth, yet each one resonated with the weight of his authority. He stopped a few paces from Alara, close enough for her to discern the intricate beadwork on his buckskin tunic, the lines of experience etched around his eyes, the almost regal bearing of his posture. He was not a man to be trifled with, yet there was a stillness about him, a quiet observation that spoke of wisdom rather than overt aggression. The boy, now safely cradled in another warrior's arms, was a silent witness to this tense, unprecedented encounter. The silence between the chieftain and Alara stretched, long and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the nervous snorts of the horses and the endless sigh of the prairie wind. It was a silence filled with questions, with unspoken accusations, with the vast, unexplored territory of human empathy and suspicion. Alara held her breath, her gaze locked with his, refusing to be the first to break eye contact, refusing to show any weakness. She had done what she believed was right, regardless of the consequences, and she would stand by that decision. Finally, the chieftain spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and though his words were in his own language, the tone was clear, demanding. He gestured towards the cabin, then to his son, then back to her. Alara understood the essence of the question. Why? Why did you do this? It was a query steeped in the history of their peoples, a challenge to the very nature of their assumed enmity. Why would a white woman shelter a Comanche boy? What was her motive? Was it a trap, a trick, or something far more unfathomable in this brutal land? She could offer no easy explanation, no simple answer that would bridge the chasm of their different worlds. Her motives were complex, rooted in personal grief and a stubborn refusal to let another life succumb to the harshness of existence. How could she articulate the ghost of her own lost child, the silent promise she had made to a memory that fueled her actions? She could not. Her answer, when it came, was simple, blunt, yet imbued with all the subtext of her life. He was hurt, she said, her voice raspy, unaccustomed to prolonged speech. Her gaze did not waver from his. He would have died. The words hung in the air, stark and unadorned. They carried no plea, no demand, no expectation. They were simply a statement of fact, a truth born of the harsh reality they both inhabited. The chieftain's eyes, which had been narrow and scrutinizing, softened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something passed through them, a flash of understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of shared humanity in the face of suffering. He looked at his son, then back at Alara, a profound silence once more settling between them. It was a moment pregnant with possibility, a single breath holding the balance between hostility and a tenuous, fragile truce. The other warriors remained still, their eyes fixed on their leader, awaiting his command, their own thoughts an impenetrable mystery. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the prairie, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple, a dramatic backdrop for a silent drama that would determine the fate of one woman, and perhaps hint at the future of two worlds. The tension was a palpable current flowing between them, building to an inevitable climax. The chieftain's gaze remained fixed on Alara, a deep, searching look that seemed to penetrate beyond her weathered exterior, beyond the layers of caution and stoicism, to the raw, vulnerable core of her being. He saw not just a white woman, an outsider, but perhaps a flicker of something he understood, something that transcended the historical animosity that bound their peoples. He saw the grim determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed the immense strain of the past few days. And he saw, perhaps, a reflection of the same tenacity, the same fierce will to survive, that characterized his own people. The air between them, once thick with suspicion, began to shift, to thin, replaced by a strange, almost respectful understanding. It was a silent acknowledgement of a shared burden, of lives shaped by hardship and the relentless demands of the land. The boy, still held by the warrior, coughed softly, a small, fragile sound that broke the profound silence. The chieftain turned his head slightly, his gaze resting on his son. A flicker of deep emotion crossed his face, relief, gratitude, and an undeniable love that transcended the rigid stoicism of his culture. He then returned his eyes to Alara, and this time there was a subtle softening, a lessening of the inherent tension. He lifted his hand again, not in a gesture of threat but of something else entirely. He spoke, a single word in his own language. The warrior holding the boy responded, then gently placed the child on his feet. The boy, though still weak, took a tentative step towards Alara. He reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched her arm, a fleeting, tender gesture that spoke volumes where words could not. It was a silent acknowledgement of the care she had provided, a child's simple, unburdened thanks. Then he looked up at his father, a question in his eyes. The chieftain nodded, a subtle tilt of his head, and the boy, after one last lingering glance at Alara, turned and walked slowly back to his father, the small figure disappearing into the embrace of his people. Alara watched the interaction, a strange wave of emotions washing over her, a quiet sense of completion, a subtle pang of loss, and a profound, unexpected sense of peace. She had opened her door, however reluctantly, to an alien presence, and in doing so had confronted the deepest parts of herself. The memory of her own lost child, a pain she had carried like a physical wound, seemed to lighten, its sharp edges blunted by this strange, unexpected act of salvation. She realized now that her act of kindness was not just for the Comanche boy, but for the grieving woman she had become. It was a quiet act of redemption, a defiant stand against the despair that had threatened to consume her. The chieftain watched his son rejoin the group, then turned back to Alara. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held hers, a profound, lingering connection that spoke of more than just a momentary truce. It was a silent, unwritten accord, a recognition of shared humanity forged in the crucible of unlikely circumstance. The chieftain remained silent for another long moment, his gaze unwavering, a study in quiet intensity. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into a pouch tied to his belt. Alara tensed, her mind racing, bracing for an offering, a demand, or perhaps a threat. But what he produced was a small, intricately carved wooden figure, a stylized representation of a swift hawk in flight. It was a simple object, yet imbued with an unmistakable craftsmanship and an almost sacred significance. He extended it to her, his hand open, palm up. His eyes, dark and fathomable, held hers, conveying a message beyond words. It was a gesture of profound respect, of gratitude, a symbol of the life she had preserved. Alara hesitated for a heartbeat, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to accept it. The wood was smooth, warm from his touch, a tangible link between their two disparate worlds. This was no payment. It was an acknowledgement, a silent promise, perhaps even a blessing. He spoke again, a single resonant word in his language. It was a word that sounded like thanks or peace, a guttural sound that carried the weight of sincerity. Then, without another word, he turned. With an elegant stride, he returned to his horse, mounted in one fluid motion, and surveyed his warriors, a silent command passing between them. The group, a formidable force, began to turn their horses, their movements synchronized, a silent, disciplined departure. The boy, now safely among his people, cast one last look back at the small cabin, at the lone woman standing in its doorway. A fleeting glance, filled with the innocent curiosity of childhood and a silent gratitude, before he was swept into the larger narrative of his tribe. Ilara watched them go, a dust cloud rising again, but this time it was a cloud of departure, not arrival. The thunder of hooves faded into the vastness of the plains, diminishing until it was once again just the whisper of the wind. The silence that settled over the prairie was different now. It was no longer the oppressive, isolating silence she had known. There was a lightness to it, a subtle shift in the very fabric of her world. The hawk carving, cool and smooth in her palm, was a tangible reminder of the impossible choice she had made, and the unexpected outcome. She had faced her fears, confronted the ingrained prejudices, and in doing so had found a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. The past, with its ghosts and its unresolved grief, still lingered, a pervasive undercurrent in her life. But now, it was tempered by a new understanding, a glimmer of hope that even in this harsh, unforgiving land, acts of empathy, however small, could ripple outwards, creating unexpected connections. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, now felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. Her hands, still calloused, now held not just the weight of labor, but the lightness of a silent, profound understanding. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson, a dramatic end to a tense emotional odyssey. The last vestiges of the dust cloud dissolved into the horizon, leaving behind only the boundless expanse of the prairie, stretching endlessly under a sky now deepening into twilight. Ilara remained standing, motionless in the doorway of her cabin, the small wooden hawk clutched tightly in her hand. The silence that enveloped her was profound, but it was no longer the haunting, empty silence she had known for so long. It was imbued with a new resonance, a quiet echo of the dramatic events that had just unfolded. The weight of the world, which had pressed down upon her with such crushing force just moments before, had lifted, replaced by a strange, almost buoyant sense of release. She had faced down an unimaginable threat, not with weapons or defiance, but with a stubborn, human act of compassion. And in doing so, she had peeled back a layer of her own hardened exterior, revealing a core of vulnerability and an unexpected capacity for empathy that even she had forgotten existed. The cabin, her solitary haven, felt different now. Its walls, once a barrier against a hostile world, seemed to whisper with the memory of a child's pained breaths, of whispered words in a foreign tongue, of a fragile life clinging to existence. Her hands, calloused and strong, still bore the faint scent of antiseptic herbs and dried blood, a testament to the quiet, grueling battle she had waged within these very walls. But the marks were no longer just reminders of labor. They were a silent emblem of a life saved, of a connection forged across the most improbable of divides. The hawk, smooth beneath her thumb, was a constant, tangible reminder, a silent narrator of a story that defied the prevailing narratives of conflict and hatred. It symbolized not just the gratitude of a chieftain, but the resilience of the human spirit, its stubborn insistence on finding connection even in the bleakest of landscapes. The sun dipped entirely below the horizon, painting the sky in a final, glorious burst of deep purples and fiery oranges. A single star pricked through the twilight, a beacon in the darkening expanse. Ilara finally moved, stepping back inside the cabin, the heavy wooden door closing behind her with a soft thud. The interior was dim, the embers in the hearth casting long, flickering shadows. She moved to the cot where the boy had lain, her fingers tracing the indentation his small body had left in the straw mattress. There was no sadness in the gesture, only a quiet contemplation. Her life would return to its solitary rhythm, the days filled with the relentless demands of survival on the plains. But something fundamental had shifted within her. She was no longer just the grieving, isolated woman she had been. She carried with her now the indelible mark of a profound encounter, a silent pact forged in blood and compassion. The echoes of the horse's hooves would fade, the dust would settle, but the memory of the wounded boy, the silent chieftain, and the fragile bridge of humanity they had collectively built would remain. It was a story woven not just into the fabric of her own being, but into the very silence of the endless prairie, a quiet testament to the enduring, hopeful truth that even in the darkest of times, compassion could miraculously find a way to bloom.